Atheist Alliance International podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International podcast. I'm Jason Sylvester, aka Diogenes of Mayberry. I'd like to apologize. We didn't have a show last week. I was out due to a death in my wife's family, so apologize that we weren't here last week. But we're back this week with Peter Monk from the National Secular Lobby in Australia, who's here to talk to us about his organization and a couple of points that have made the news recently. So just before we get started, please, everybody, like and subscribe, and don't forget to leave your comments. And so, Peter, thank you for joining us today. You are the president of the National Secular Lobby, as I understand.
That's right. Yeah, thanks, Jason, very much for having me on today. So the National Secular Lobby are a fairly young organisation. We've been around about 4 years. And obviously there are already many groups active in the kind of atheist, secular, humanist area in Australia. But we thought we would focus particularly on the secular side of things, especially in regards to kind of political activity. So we joined the fray, and we're hoping to see what we can do.
Yeah. So 4 years. So have you had any successes in your early years, or you're still building up in your campaigns?
We are obviously still trying to build a good following. I think we already have a fairly decent following, and we've certainly scored a few successes. I think probably one of the most notable ones is during the earlier stages of the religious discrimination / religious freedom discussion. We managed to have a debate at the National Press Club. One of our organisation ambassadors, Fiona Patton, had a debate with Martin Iles, who's the head of the Australian Christian Lobby, so she kind of represented us there, and I think it was a very good debate, and certainly kind of a fairly high profile. We've looked at a few different issues since we've started up. The religious discrimination bill being one of them, and other things such as the legalization of voluntary euthanasia, abortion legislation, the prioritization of funding for public schools as opposed to private schools, and also things like the removal of prayers from Parliament, which is still, you probably know, prayers are still said in our parliaments and governments at all levels in Australia. Yeah,
it's a bit shocking. Like what amazes me that the stories that I've learned from the Aussies we've had on the show in the last couple of months, that this is the kind of stuff you would expect in the Bible Belt in the United States. You wouldn't necessarily associate this with Australia. I understand that your current prime minister is a Pentecostal, and all of these, like you said, like the prayer in schools and in government. I think at least for myself, I think when people think of Australia, you think of this sort of really sort of laid back, chilled, Bondi Beach kind of you don't really think of this as a country that would have such a Christian influence in its government, that it'd be a much more liberal, laid-back sort of society. So it's a bit surprising to hear about like the chaplaincy program and the prayer in Parliament. So I'm glad that there's people like your organization that's out there.
Yeah, I think we kind of inherited a lot of that from England. I mean, there was definitely, back when the very first kind of state acts were being drawn up. This is kind of late 19th century. And even to the drawing up of the Constitution, there was a definite feel amongst the people framing these laws at that time that they wanted to get away from the more overt influence that religion has in government. Obviously, there's done to a much larger degree in England even today. Not so much here, but I think we did inherit a lot of that kind of thinking to some degree, and there was certainly a large amount of lobbying from churches in the very early days of around Federation, 1901. and that apparently got there's one mention of God in our constitution, and that lobbying was successful in getting that added. It wasn't there originally, and in fact our state education legislation was very focused on removing religion from legislation. They removed any kind of scripture classes from school, and they removed government funding of religion altogether. And, through various lobbying attempts over time, it's just kind of come back in. And as you say, we have a Prime Minister now who's, probably not against that being there. And certainly, obviously, we've had a liberal conservative government since 2013, and they've just, kind of, I suppose, been supporting all that.
So, other than your prime minister, has he sort of stacked his cabinet with other religious people, or he's pretty much the only one in the government that is of a more evangelical Christian background?
No, there are quite a few members, actually, I think, that are actually specifically Pentecostal. But certainly, if you look at the makeup of the people in Parliament, they tend to be a much higher percentage religious compared to the general population of the country. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Has it always been like that, or that's just a sort of a recent shift in your government?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, yes, Australia, certainly around the times of Federation, the general population was something around 98% Christian. So we were certainly, I suppose, by that definition, we were a Christian country back then. Obviously, that's dropped off over time to the point where now it's, I think it's, well, certainly when we just had our census last year, and the figures aren't out yet, but they're due out in about 6 months. And it's looking like at that point, the figure of the Christian population, Christian percentage of the population will fall below 50% for the first time. So yeah, that's been a continuous change over time ever since Federation. Yeah, and it's I guess it's just for whatever reason there are a larger percentage of religious people in government in Parliament.
Okay. So you're dealing with the legacy of sort of the Victorian era morality and what got pulled into your laws, and we're seeing this all over the world, that the shift away from religion to the nuns. So yeah, hopefully maybe some of these people will be voted out in the next election. So. Okay. So so Australia's been in the news in the last couple of weeks. There's been a couple of issues. We touched briefly on the religious discrimination bill. So maybe you can give us a little bit of background of what this bill is all about.
Yeah, sure. So I guess if you're looking at the religious discrimination bill, you really kind of have to go back to 2017. We had a plebiscite, basically a voluntary postal vote on the issue of same-sex marriage in the country. This is something it's an issue that had kind of enjoyed, I guess, significant popular support, but because we'd had, as I said, a conservative government in power ever since 2013, they'd been essentially trying to avoid dealing with the issue for as long as possible, because obviously their supporters are conservative, and there's a much larger contingent of religious or pro-religious people supporting that government, that party as well. So I think they kind of exhausted every option, and their final option was, well, all right, we'll have a vote on the issue, essentially. And that vote passed with, I think, about 63% or something in favour. So we had legalised same-sex marriage after that. And I think that kind of, I guess there were some people on the conservative side, the kind of more, I suppose, ultra-religious, ultra-conservative side. I'm not sure what the best description is, but there were a lot of people concerned that with the inevitable march of progressive policy, which seemed to be happening, they were concerned about their kind of what they saw as being their core religious freedoms as being threatened by that. And as part of this, after the same-sex marriage plebiscite went through, there was a promise made by by the government, Scott Morrison, basically assuring people that he would introduce legislation kind of better protecting those religious freedoms. And following that, there was a review done of the current status of religious freedom in Australia that was done back in 2018. And the outcome of that was basically that there really wasn't a huge problem in Australia. There was already a good degree of religious freedom in terms of what religious people could do and how they could express themselves. And there was no evidence really of any kind of systematic discrimination against religious people. The inquiry did note that we'd benefit from some changes in the legislation and the way it was put together. So I guess one of the issues with religious discrimination legislation is that it's handled mostly at the state level rather than the federal level. So you've got a fairly large degree of inconsistency in laws from state to state. The other issue they identified was that in a lot of cases, the rights for religious expression kind of are handled through exemptions to existing laws. So as you're probably aware, there's some ability here for religious schools to discriminate legally against LGBTI staff and students. And that's handled through an exemption to the Sex Discrimination Act. So there was a view that from this inquiry that essentially things weren't that bad. We didn't need a lot of change, but we could do some change with the way that the legislation was handled. And so from that point onwards, the Religious Discrimination Bill was kind of put together. It's always been, throughout its lifetime, a very contentious bit of legislation. Scott Morrison has kind of been stuck between a rock and a hard place because on the one hand, you've got religious groups, religious leaders, and religious lobby groups, such as the Christian lobby group, who are obviously intent for greater rights, and they often just kind of push things as much as they can in that direction. On the other hand, as I said, most of the population weren't really in favour of a lot of these more draconian rights to discriminate and things like that. And a lot of some of the political parties were against it, and also some members of the Liberal Party, Scott Morrison's party, were also against it. So I guess it was an odd bit of legislation in that when it was released, it was basically disliked by everyone on all sides for very different reasons. And I think that's eventually what got it scuttled is there was simply no way to make this work. And that's due to the way that the legislation's been formulated. It differs from other federal anti-discrimination legislation in that it in itself allows discrimination. And it also overrode some of the existing anti-discrimination rights that have been put in at the state level as well. And, for these reasons, it was very unpopular.
So it sounds like it's more about the Christians primarily, I would assume, but I'm guessing they probably wrote it in terms of protection for all religions, but basically to allow the Christians the privilege to discriminate against those groups that they didn't like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a legislation that on paper covers every religion, including atheism, because for the purposes of this legislation, atheism is defined as a religion, in order to kind of work protections for non-religious people into it. But yeah, in practice, it benefited most of all Christians simply because in terms of religious activity in things like provision of education and healthcare and things like that, obviously you've got some service provision being done by faith-based groups, and those are for the most part Christian. So yes, on paper it is kind of affects everyone evenly, but in practice, no, it wouldn't. Christians would be better off, and atheists would be worst off, basically.
All right. And so then what hit the news this week, and the headline from the Sydney Morning Herald says the scuttling of the religion package shows where the priorities lay all along. So it sounds like the Christians withdrew their support for this bill that they've been advocating for because it suddenly wouldn't allow them to discriminate against, I guess, primarily against LGBTQ students. Or maybe you can inform us a little more on what your understanding is of why they suddenly pulled their support for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, as I've said, because of the contentiousness of this bill and the fact that there was not enough support in the Prime Minister's own party to push this through without having to consider amendments. Labor, the opposing party, they've been really quite kind of oddly silent on this whole thing. I guess because they know that it's very contentious and they just don't want to set a foot wrong. But they finally kind of said that, well, obviously we support religious freedom, but we don't think that there should be legalized discrimination. They didn't quite have the numbers to kind of stop it altogether, but they were successful with the aid of some of the other parties and also a few of the members from the Liberal Party in getting this amendment through. So the gist of the amendment is that it would prevent gay students from being expelled from religious schools. It would not prevent trans students from being expelled, and it wouldn't prevent in its entirety discrimination against gay students in religious schools. So there was this kind of idea too that religious schools could, if they wanted to, make life difficult for gay students, even if they couldn't legally get rid of them. So that was that was still a big concern. But yeah, as you say, as soon as this amendment was put through, the Australian Christian lobby in particular, who's been one of the most vocal voices for the religious discrimination bill, said that the Prime Minister had essentially betrayed the intent of the bill and had ruined it, and they wanted it gone. Basically, in this form, it was no use to them, even though the more basic, shield type protections for religious Australians were still there. They hadn't changed. All that had really changed in substance was this ability for religious schools to expel gay students. And once that right was gone, they withdrew their support, and the government realised at that point that it wasn't going to go anywhere. That they had also some dissension in the Senate, the upper house as well, and they realised that it just wasn't going to go through. So they pulled the pin.
So the discrimination bill on the surface was for Christians to claim that secular society could not discriminate against them, but they basically wanted to weaponize it to be able to discriminate against gay and trans students. And then as soon as that was taken away, they walked away from it. So that just totally betrays their hypocrisy. So,
well, yeah. I mean, I guess there is something that's become apparent is there's quite a difference in terms of what some religious leaders want and what the religious lobby groups want compared to what the average Australian Christian wants. There are a lot of religious schools who don't discriminate against gay students. There are a lot of other faith-based organisations who don't discriminate. Especially there was a media statement made by St Vincent de Paul, one of the big charities over here, basically against the discrimination bill, saying whatever additional abilities it gave them in terms of discrimination, they didn't want it. And it's really just been some religious leaders and the religious lobby groups who have really pushed for this, and the Liberal Party itself, more than anyone. And yeah, I guess once that support was rapidly vanishing, they realised there was really nothing they could do that wouldn't cost them dearly in the next election, which is coming up in just a couple of months.
Okay, and so as you say, it seems to be driven by the agenda of the leader for their own gain. So, which sort of brings us to the next point. So, about a week ago, it came out that the City Point Christian School in Brisbane had suddenly changed their charter to basically discriminate against gay and trans students. And from what I read, again in the Sydney Morning Herald, that this was basically came from, probably the headmaster is the right term or not, basically came from him, was a unilateral declaration that he just changed the school's charter and basically foisted it on the parents like a day before the term was about to start. So that again seems to be back to your point that this, it's what the leaders want, not what the parents want or other people in the community. So have you been following that City Point scandal, I guess is probably a good word?
Yeah, well, yes, yeah. So City Point are actually, so the school is actually just part of City Point. City Point is actually a church in much the same way that Hillsong is a church. It's a massive organization. They also have their own music entertainment wing, just like Hillsong do. And so the City Point Christian College, which is where the trouble was, is just part of the whole City Point church group. And yeah, as you say, they essentially 1 or 2 days before the school year was due to start, they sent this document home to parents to sign, and it was basically a statement of belief that they had to kind of agree to. And it was essentially saying that homosexual acts are immoral. They kind of put them on a list. They put homosexuality on a list along with things like bestiality and incest and pedophilia as being kind of destructive to society and offensive to God. And obviously there was this fairly immediate and huge backlash from the community. A lot of parents didn't like it. They weren't comfortable with it. Someone launched an online petition that rapidly got to something like 150,000 signatures. And yeah, the issue just blew up overnight, pretty much. It was, yeah, and it was just a huge issue.
Yeah, I didn't follow the story that closely about the linking of pedophilia and all of that. So that's always the standard line that they use,
Yes.
which is pretty morally reprehensible to associate the false equivalency of homosexuality with pedophilia and bestiality and incest. It's a disservice and it's an insult to our intelligence. But these, I guess that they're willing to believe that, rib man or rib woman and a dirt man, gave birth to all of civilization, and they'll believe anything. So, okay. So after this, the 150,000 signatures, has the school retracted, or are they holding firm in their new position?
They initially doubled down. The principal released a statement, a video statement, kind of explaining their position. They gave the parents I think it was a 2-week extension or something to sign this thing. But obviously it just got worse and worse for them. And it was only, I think, probably a couple of days after that, I reckon, that they retracted it. And then the principal took an extended leave of absence from his job.
Okay. I did not hear that. So that's good to know it's good to know that they realized they crossed the line and that the public support just wasn't there for his medieval thinking. So yeah, it's good to see he's gone. So okay. I was pretty sure that they would dig their heels in and the parents would just pull their students and the school would collapse. So
well, I mean, the issue, I think, is that according to the current state laws, because as I mentioned earlier, the laws in this area kind of are different from state to state. In this case, I think what they did was actually against the law. I don't think that in Queensland, religious schools have quite the same degree of exception to the discrimination laws that they do in some other states. And I know I think it was the Australian Human Rights Commission did get involved and said that they would be investigating. So I imagine that was part of it. But yeah, I guess it was terrible timing for Scott Morrison, because of course this just blew up into a massive controversy. This was like, I think about a week before the discrimination bill was due to be debated in Parliament. Obviously, it caused a massive negative reaction. I assume the school was just emboldened by what the discrimination bill was probably about to allow them to do. and they just kind of jumped the gun a bit. And but of course, yeah, it was very bad for Scott Morrison attempting to get this bill through, because it certainly brought a lot more negative attention to it. It made, I think, some members of Parliament think more about what they were about to put through, and certainly it was a lot of negative public attention on the issue, and I'm certain that it played some part in the difficulty that the bill faced in Parliament next week.
Okay, well, it's good to see that people are fighting back against this kind of archaic thinking. So you said there's an election coming up. When is that?
No date set for it yet, but it has to be, I think, end of May, I think, is the deadline for having an election, and I think it has to be called by the Prime Minister. I think it's a month in advance. So we're kind of basically waiting on the announcement of when exactly it'll be. But yeah, within the next couple of months. Yeah.
Okay, so the campaigning hasn't started yet. So what's your sense of with your organization and being a secular lobby? Is there a sense that Morrison's going to lose, that people are just fed up with all this Pentecostal nonsense?
There's definitely a feeling of that. I guess the real problem is that a lot of people felt this way in the last election too. And I guess they're worried. They don't want to jinx it, I suppose, because it looked like Morrison was in trouble in the 2017 election. And he pulled through in the end, which I think spooked a lot of people. It certainly spooked Labor. There was a line put around, Morrison, being a man of faith, kind of called it a miracle victory. And there was a line put around by, I think, the Christian lobby to the tune of Morrison won because the Labor Party, the opposition, essentially abandoned religious Australians. Even though I think there was a poll done around the time which showed that religious issues were kind of right down the bottom of the list of concerns for Australians in general. But this story went around that Labor might have lost because they abandoned religious Australians. And I think that kind of spooked them. And that could be one reason why they've been apparently very hesitant to make much of a statement about the discrimination bill. So I think, things do look bad, I think, for Morrison, given that he's failed in a lot of areas recently. The religious discrimination bill was a promise, a promise from last election. I think he promised that he would get this done, and he hasn't. I think there's, he's failed to deliver a few of his promises, and certainly there's been many scandals on the Liberal Party in general, but also his leadership in particular. I don't know if you're aware but the bushfires we had at the start of 2020, he took a personal holiday kind of right in the middle of that, which is, no one knew why, but I guess he wanted to. But he copped a lot of flack for that. And so, yeah, I think there's been a few scandals, a bit of attention on corruption, the fact that him and his party have failed to bring about additional anti-corruption legislation that they'd also promised to look at. It looks bad for him, I think, but I suppose people are worried because it looked bad last time. So, yeah.
So with not knowing the Australian sort of political landscape, do you guys have that sort of in the US? We have like this negative campaign ads where they're trashing each other. Oh, this godless person, So do you have that in Australia, or like will that play into the campaigns of people saying, "Look at this Pentecostal and like what he's doing to our secular country"?
Yeah, we do certainly have sledging ads, negativity ads around campaign time. I don't think. Yeah, I don't think Labor would risk saying anything about his religion and using that as any kind of ammunition. I think that for them would be kind of shaky ground.
They don't want to alienate the other Christians, basically.
Yeah. There's still, even with the continual drop in religious observance in the population, we're still kind of 50 to 60% religious, somewhere around there. So, yeah, I think it'd be too risky for them to kind of really make any big statement on that front. Yeah, I guess we'll see.
So if Labour wins, does the National Secular Lobby, do you foresee like an end to the chaplaincy program under another government, or is that something that's been around and will continue to be around for a while?
It's been around for a long time, and last time we had a Labour government which was just before 2013. Julia Gillard was Prime Minister. She did not stop the program, but I think it's one of those things where it's kind of got a fair bit of ongoing support, and it's kind of hard to root that kind of thing out if you want to. What she did though is she did change the program to allow to kind of broaden it to allow secular chaplains, which I know is not a very good term, but that's essentially what they are. So currently, because as soon as the Liberals got back in, they changed the law back again. Currently, you have to be from one of the major faiths in order to be a school chaplain, and even if a school wants a secular chaplain, they can't get one under the current program. So at least Julia Gillard broadened the program to make it not so narrow in terms of the faith requirement. And if Labor get back in, they might do that again, I suppose. Whether they can get rid of it altogether, assuming they want to, I don't know. But yeah, certainly in general, their policies are a bit more in line with our views. Just a little bit, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll have to wait and maybe pray a little bit and see the way
Yes.
and what happens, and if we can get rid of the chaplaincy program. So, Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us today and telling us about what's been going on there. It's been informative to get a bit more detail on the City Point and the discrimination bill. As I said, I wasn't aware that City Point had backtracked, and that the principal had leave of absence.
Yes.
So yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, so we'll have to follow up, I guess, in May, and we'll see what happens with the election of the new government, and keep in touch. So.
Interesting times. Yeah.
Great. So, okay.
Thanks,
So thanks, Peter, who's again from the Australian National Secular Lobby. We'll put some links in the description if you want to go and find them and maybe support them or join them and become one of their members. So as always, please remember to like and subscribe, leave your comments for us, and we'll see everybody on the next episode. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.